At the beginning of this phase of manufacturing, we had a complete frame. My group decided that our benchmark was going to be completed suspension. The audience will know we've completed our benchmark when they see completed suspension. The first thing we had to do was build the pieces of our suspension. On each side of the back of our HPV, we were going to have two quadrilateral suspension side arms, one on top of the other, that would pivot up and allow suspension to happen. So first we have to cut out the pieces for the side arms and then weld them together. And we have to make 4 of them. And when we welded them all together, there we have them. And so the top ones needed to have a crossbar on them so that we could put supports for the spring for our suspension. And you can see one of the supports sitting on the sidebar there. So then we welded those together and had our completed side arms. Then we had to make the hinges that our suspension would hinge on and weld that onto our frame. And we were going to have 2 little hinges on the frame and then one fatter one in the middle on the suspension, which would go in between. And that's what it'll look like when they match up. And here's what it looks like. So then we saw they would attach, but they didn't fit perfectly, so we had to do a lot of grinding before we could get them to actually pivot, but eventually we got those parts assembled. Next we had to make the housing for our suspension, which you can see we have 3 of them sitting there, which would not let the spring go wherever it wanted. And eventually we put that through the bolt and you can see that it's attached. Meanwhile, Jack was busy making some hinges for our front steering to get ahead on that. And you can see some of the hinges sitting here. And he also started making the hinges for the front of the suspension that will allow the 2 side arms to hinge up and down while the wheel remains perpendicular to the ground. Jack also used the PlasmaCam software to design some pieces, also for our front steering, and cut those out using the PlasmaCam. While that was going on, I welded some hinges to the front piece that was going to go between the side arms of our suspension, and got that so it could all hinge. So then we decided to put it all together, and the sidearm parts all fit and hinged perfectly, but when we tried to put in the spring and the housing, it turned out that for the way we'd set up the supports for the bolts that would go through the housing for the spring was just too long and it wouldn't fit. But luckily this isn't the biggest problem in the world, since we think that if we just find a shorter spring, it will all fit perfectly. So there you can see our pretty much complete suspension except for the springs. So as you can see, we pretty much completed our benchmark except for the spring issue. And our next steps will be steering and propulsion.